What happens when the world's most elite soldiers leave one of their own to die in the scorching desert? What unfolds next will challenge everything you think you know about survival, loyalty, and the true meaning of strength. This isn't just another military story. It's a testament to the unbreakable human spirit and the shocking truths hidden within America's most secretive Special Forces unit. Sarah Mitchell thought she knew what she was getting into when she volunteered for the most grueling military selection process in the world. She was wrong. What she discovered in those merciless desert sands would redefine not just her understanding of survival, but reveal the dark psychology behind creating the world's deadliest warriors. Prepare yourself for a journey that will leave you questioning the price of perfection and the true cost of creating soldiers who operate beyond the boundaries of human limitation. The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of amber and gold, but Sarah Mitchell couldn't appreciate the beauty. Every fiber of her being focused on the simple act of putting one boot in front of the other. She had been walking for 18 hours straight, carrying a 60-pound rucksack that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The Delta Force selection course was designed to break people, and after 3 weeks of relentless testing, Sarah understood why 90% of candidates never made it through. She wasn't supposed to be here. Women weren't officially allowed in Delta Force selection, but times were changing, and Sarah had become part of an experimental program that would determine if the military's most elite unit would open its doors to female operators. The pressure wasn't just on her shoulders, it was on the entire future of women in special operations. Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her skin. The instructors, known simply as cadre, watched her every move with cold, calculating eyes. She had learned their names over the past weeks. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a mountain of a man with scars that told stories of battles fought in places the public would never know about. Staff Sergeant Chun, whose quiet demeanor masked a mind that could calculate distances, wind patterns, and human weaknesses with mathematical precision. And then there was Sergeant Major Williams, the selection course commander, whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. The cadre never encouraged. They never offered motivation. They simply observed, took notes, and waited for candidates to quit. Sarah had watched dozens of highly trained soldiers, Rangers, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, simply stop walking and raise their hands and surrender. The moment they did, a vehicle would appear as if from nowhere, and they would disappear from the course forever. But Sarah hadn't come this far to quit. Growing up in rural Montana, she had learned early that survival meant adapting to whatever nature threw at you. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke about his service, had taught her to hunt, track, and navigate using nothing but the stars. Her mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to keep their family afloat, had shown her that mental toughness came from having something worth fighting for. The military had been Sarah's escape route from a life of limited options. She enlisted the day after high school graduation, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a determination to prove herself in a world that constantly told her she didn't belong. 8 years of service had taken her from basic training to Ranger School, from Iraq to Afghanistan, and now to this desolate stretch of desert where dreams came to die. The selection course operated on a simple principle: stress inoculation. Every day brought new challenges designed to push candidates beyond their physical and mental limits. Sleep deprivation was a constant companion. Meals were irregular and often consisted of nothing more than an energy bar eaten while walking. Navigation exercises took candidates through terrain that seemed designed by someone with a sadistic imagination. Sarah's feet had long since gone numb, and she could feel blisters forming on top of existing blisters. Her water supplies were carefully rationed. The cadre monitored consumption to ensure candidates couldn't simply drink their way through dehydration. Every ounce of liquid had to be earned through precise navigation and timely arrival at checkpoints scattered across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The psychological warfare was even more brutal than the physical demands. Instructors would change routes without warning, add weight to rucksacks when candidates weren't looking, and deliberately provide conflicting information to test decision-making under stress. Some candidates cracked under the constant pressure, began talking to themselves or breaking down in tears. Others became aggressive, lashing out at fellow candidates or even the instructors themselves. Both reactions led to immediate dismissal. Sarah had developed her own survival strategy, compartmentalization. She broke each day into manageable segments, focusing only on reaching the next checkpoint or surviving the next hour. She didn't think about home, about the warm bed waiting in her barracks, or about the possibility of failure. Those thoughts were luxuries she couldn't afford. The desert landscape around her told its own story of survival and adaptation. Cacti stood like sentinels, their thick skin protecting precious water reserves. Lizards darted between rocks, conserving energy and seeking shade during the hottest parts of the day. Even the plants seemed to understand something about persistence that many humans had forgotten. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself walking alongside Martinez, a former Green Beret from Texas who had been quietly impressing the instructors with his methodical approach to every challenge. They didn't speak. Conversation was discouraged and cost precious energy, but there was comfort in shared suffering. Martinez had 3 daughters back home, their pictures carefully preserved in a waterproof pouch in his breast pocket. Sarah had seen him looking at them during the few moments of rest allowed each day, his weathered face softening momentarily before the mask of determination slipped back into place. She wondered what drove him to put himself through this torture, what made the possibility of joining Delta Force worth the risk of never seeing his family again. The afternoon heat was becoming unbearable. The desert floor radiated warmth that seemed to come from the earth itself, and Sarah could see heat mirages dancing in the distance. Her uniform was soaked with sweat despite her efforts to conserve moisture. The salt from dried perspiration had begun to cake on her skin, creating an uncomfortable layer that chafed with every movement. At 1,400 hours, the candidates reached a checkpoint where Sergeant Major Williams waited with his characteristic stoic expression. He stood in the shade of a military vehicle, wearing sunglasses that reflected the desert sun like mirrors. In his hands was a clipboard that contained the fate of every person walking toward him. Sarah approached the checkpoint with measured steps, her military bearing intact despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. She presented her map case and waited for inspection. Williams examined her navigation work with the thoroughness of a surgeon, checking distances, bearing calculations, and route selection. The Sergeant Major's evaluation process was legendary among special operations candidates. He could identify weaknesses in character with the same precision that a sniper could place bullets on target. Some said he had an almost supernatural ability to predict which candidates would ultimately succeed and which were destined to fail. After what felt like an eternity, Williams nodded and made a notation on his clipboard. Sarah was cleared to continue, but not before receiving new coordinates that would take her deeper into the desert than she had ever been. The next checkpoint was 23 miles away, across terrain that looked like the surface of Mars. As Sarah prepared to leave the checkpoint, she noticed something unusual. The cadre members were exchanging glances and having whispered conversations among themselves. In 3 weeks of selection, she had never seen them display anything resembling emotion or uncertainty. Something was different about this next phase of the course. Williams approached her with a serious expression that seemed even more grave than usual. His voice was low and measured when he spoke, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. "Mitchell, you've made it further than most people thought possible. What happens next is going to test everything you think you know about yourself and about what it means to be a soldier." Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond to what sounded almost like a warning. Williams continued, his eyes studying her face for any sign of weakness or doubt. "The next checkpoint is your final navigation exercise. Everything you've learned, everything you've endured, has been preparation for what you're about to face. Some candidates discover they have reserves of strength they never knew existed. Others discover they have limits they didn't know they possessed." The sergeant major handed her a sealed envelope along with new map coordinates. "You'll open this when you reach the halfway point to your next objective. Follow the instructions exactly as written. Do not deviate from the plan, no matter what your instincts tell you." Sarah accepted the envelope and secured it in her chest pocket. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, as if it contained something far heavier than paper and ink. Williams stepped back and gestured toward the desert that stretched endlessly ahead of her. Your time starts now, Mitchell. 23 miles. You have until sunrise tomorrow to reach your destination. Sarah checked her compass bearing and began walking toward what appeared to be nothing but empty desert. Behind her, she could hear the sound of vehicles starting up, and she realized with a growing sense of unease that the cadre were leaving the checkpoint. For the first time since selection began, she would be completely alone in the wilderness with no immediate support or oversight. The first few hours passed in relative normalcy. Sarah maintained a steady pace, stopping every hour to check her navigation and adjust her route as necessary. The desert terrain was challenging but manageable, consisting mainly of sandy washes and low hills covered in scrub brush and scattered rocks. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the landscape around her. The vegetation was becoming sparser, and the ground was transitioning from sandy soil to hardpan that reflected heat like a furnace. Water sources that might exist in other parts of the desert were nowhere to be found here. When she reached the halfway point marked on her map, Sarah stopped and carefully opened the sealed envelope Williams had given her. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typewritten instructions that made her blood run cold. Your final test begins now. Leave your water, your food, and your radio at this location. Continue to the final checkpoint using only your survival skills and mental toughness. This is what separates Delta Force operators from everyone else. The ability to survive when all conventional support systems have been stripped away. The desert night descended upon Sarah like a suffocating blanket, bringing with it a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Without her radio, she felt truly isolated for the first time since the selection course began. The only sounds were her own footsteps crunching on the hardpan surface and the occasional distant cry of a coyote that seemed to mock her predicament. Sarah had been walking for 3 hours since abandoning her supplies, and already she could feel the effects of dehydration beginning to take hold. Her mouth felt dry and cottony, and she found herself unconsciously running her tongue across her lips in a futile attempt to generate moisture. The temperature had dropped significantly from the day's high, but her body was still losing precious fluids through perspiration and respiration. The navigation was becoming increasingly difficult in the darkness. Her red-filtered flashlight provided just enough illumination to read her compass and map without destroying her night vision. But the terrain features that had been clearly visible during daylight now appeared as menacing shadows that could easily lead her astray. Every rock formation looked similar, and the gentle hills that had seemed manageable during the day now loomed like mountains in the darkness. She had memorized the route as best she could before the sun set, identifying key landmarks and calculating approximate distances between them. But memory was proving to be an unreliable guide when every step had to be carefully considered to avoid injury. A twisted ankle or fall could be catastrophic when help was hours away and she had no means of communication. The psychological impact of isolation was perhaps more challenging than the physical hardships. For 3 weeks, Sarah had been surrounded by other candidates, instructors, and the constant activity of the selection course. There had always been someone watching, evaluating, and providing a human connection, however tenuous. Now she was truly alone with nothing but her thoughts and the vast indifference of the desert. Her mind began to wander as the hours passed, a dangerous tendency that she had to constantly fight against. She found herself thinking about her childhood in Montana, about summer camping trips with her father where they would spend days in the wilderness with minimal supplies. He had taught her that survival was as much about mental attitude as physical preparation, that the human mind could be either the greatest ally or the worst enemy in life-threatening situations. She remembered one particular trip when she was 12 years old, and they had gotten lost during a sudden snowstorm. Her father had remained calm and methodical, using the skills he had learned in Vietnam to navigate by dead reckoning until they found their way back to camp. But it was what he told her afterward that had stuck with her through all the years that followed. The moment you give up in your head, he had said, your body follows. But if you can keep your mind focused on the next step, the next decision, the next small victory, you can survive things that would break other people. Those words echoed in her mind now as she carefully picked her way across a rocky wash that appeared to have been carved by flash floods from decades past. The stones were loose and treacherous, and she had to test each step before committing her full weight. A fall here could result in serious injury, and without her radio, it could be days before anyone found her. The cold was becoming a serious concern as the night deepened. Desert temperatures could drop 40 or 50 degrees from their daytime highs, and Sarah's sweat-soaked uniform provided little insulation. She began to shiver uncontrollably, which made accurate navigation even more difficult. Her hands shook as she tried to read her compass, and she had to pause frequently to warm her fingers enough to manipulate the equipment. She tried various techniques to generate body heat while continuing to move forward. Isometric exercises during brief rest stops helped maintain circulation, and she varied her pace between fast walking and slow jogging when the terrain permitted. But these activities increased her metabolic rate and accelerated the dehydration process, creating a dangerous cycle that had no easy solution. The stars above provided the only source of light beyond her flashlight, and Sarah found herself using them for navigation when possible. Her father had taught her basic celestial navigation, and she was able to identify Polaris and use it to confirm her compass bearings. The clear desert air made the stars appear unnaturally bright and close, as if she could reach up and pluck them from the sky. Around midnight, Sarah encountered her first serious obstacle. The route she had plotted took her through what appeared on the map to be a gentle valley, but the reality was a steep-sided arroyo that would require careful descent and ascent. In daylight, this might have been a minor inconvenience. In darkness, it represented a significant hazard that could easily end her journey. She spent nearly an hour exploring the rim of the arroyo, looking for a safe route down. The walls were composed of loose dirt and rock that crumbled at the touch, and she could hear stones cascading into the darkness below when she disturbed them. Eventually, she found a spot where animal trails suggested a possible path, and she began a careful descent, testing each handhold and foothold before trusting it with her weight. The climb down took over 30 minutes, and by the time she reached the bottom, her muscles were trembling from the combination of physical exertion and adrenaline. The floor of the arroyo was sandy and relatively easy to traverse, but she knew that the ascent on the far side would be even more challenging after her energy reserves had been further depleted. As she walked through the sandy bottom of the wash, Sarah began to notice something unusual about her surroundings. There were fresh tire tracks in the sand, clearly visible in her flashlight beam. The tracks appeared to have been made recently, possibly within the last day or two, and they followed a path parallel to her intended route. The discovery of the tracks created a moral dilemma that hadn't been covered in any survival manual Sarah had ever read. Should she follow the tracks in hopes of finding help, or continue on her assigned route despite the increasing risk to her life? Following the tracks might lead to safety, but it would also represent a deviation from her orders and could result in automatic dismissal from the selection course. She knelt beside the clearest set of tracks and examined them carefully with her flashlight. The tire tread pattern was consistent with military vehicles, and the spacing suggested a truck or large SUV. Whoever had driven through here had done so recently and with apparent knowledge of safe routes through the terrain. After several minutes of consideration, Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her journey. She would continue on her assigned route regardless of the consequences. The tracks might represent safety, but following them would mean abandoning the mission she had been given. If Delta Force was truly testing her ability to follow orders under extreme stress, then deviating from the plan would be an admission of failure. She climbed out of the arroyo on the far side, a process that took nearly an hour and left her completely exhausted. Her water reserves were now critically low, existing only in the small amounts of saliva her body could still produce, and the moisture she could extract from the night air by breathing through her nose. Every movement required conscious effort, and she could feel her coordination beginning to deteriorate. The landscape ahead was more challenging than anything she had encountered so far. The terrain rose steadily toward a series of low mesas that blocked out sections of the star-filled sky. The ground was covered in loose shale that shifted underfoot, and made silent movement impossible. Every step announced her presence to any wildlife that might be in the area, and she began to worry about encounters with snakes, scorpions, or other nocturnal predators. Her feet had long since gone beyond pain into a state of numbness that was almost more disturbing than the earlier agony. She could feel moisture in her boots that she hoped was perspiration rather than blood, but she couldn't afford to stop and investigate. Movement was life, and stopping for anything other than navigation checks could be fatal. The hallucinations began around 3 in the morning, subtle at first, but gradually becoming more pronounced. Sarah would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing but rocks and sparse vegetation. She began to hear voices in the wind, conversations that seemed almost real before dissolving into the natural sounds of the desert night. She recognized these symptoms as early signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion, conditions that could quickly progress from inconvenience to life-threatening emergency. Her training had covered the progression of heat injuries and dehydration, but intellectual knowledge was very different from personal experience. She knew she was entering dangerous territory, but she also knew she had no choice but to continue forward. The worst hallucination came just before dawn, when Sarah was certain she could see lights in the distance that marked the location of the final checkpoint. She altered her course and walked for nearly an hour toward what turned out to be the rising planet Venus, low on the eastern horizon. The realization that she had been chasing an optical illusion was devastating, and for the first time since the journey began, she seriously considered the possibility that she might not survive to reach her destination. She forced herself to stop and conduct a thorough navigation check, using every technique she had learned to confirm her position and bearing. The process took 30 minutes she couldn't afford to spare, but it prevented her from making additional errors that could have been fatal. According to her calculations, she was still 8 miles from the final checkpoint, with approximately 3 hours until the deadline. The eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn, and Sarah knew that sunrise would bring temperatures that could kill her in her weakened condition. She had to reach the checkpoint before the desert heat became unbearable or risk becoming another casualty of the selection course that supposedly didn't exist in any official military records. Her pace increased to a stumbling jog as desperation began to override exhaustion. She was no longer following careful navigation procedures, instead relying on general direction and the hope that she could cover the remaining distance before her body completely shut down. This was the point where training ended and pure willpower took over, where the difference between success and failure came down to something that couldn't be taught or measured. The sun cleared the eastern horizon just as Sarah crested a low hill and saw something that made her question whether she was experiencing another hallucination. In the valley below, a military vehicle sat beside what appeared to be a temporary shelter. Smoke rose from a small campfire, and she could see human figures moving around the site. Sarah stood motionless for several minutes, afraid that movement would cause the vision to dissolve like all the others. But this mirage remained solid and real, and she finally began the careful descent toward what she hoped was the end of her ordeal. Every step was agony, but for the first time in hours, she had a concrete goal that seemed achievable. As she approached the camp, one of the figures separated itself from the group and walked toward her. Even from a distance, Sarah recognized the distinctive silhouette of Sergeant Major Williams. His presence confirmed that this was indeed the final checkpoint, but it also raised questions about what would happen next. Williams watched her approach with the same neutral expression he had maintained throughout the selection process. When she was close enough to hear him clearly, he spoke in the same measured tone she remembered from their last encounter. "Mitchell, you're 3 hours ahead of schedule. How do you feel?" The question seemed surreal after everything she had endured. The shelter provided blessed relief from the morning sun that was already beginning to heat the desert air. Sarah collapsed onto a folding cot and accepted the bottle of water that Martinez handed to her with shaking hands. The first sip was pure ecstasy, and she had to force herself to drink slowly to avoid making herself sick. Her body craved the liquid desperately, but her stomach had shrunk and become sensitive after hours without food or water. Around her, the other survivors of the night's ordeal sat in various stages of recovery. Besides Martinez, there was Thompson, a former Navy SEAL from California whose normally pristine appearance had been reduced to that of a refugee, and Jackson, an Army Ranger from Georgia who looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 24 hours. All of them shared the hollow-eyed look of people who had been pushed beyond their normal limits and had somehow found the strength to continue. The conversation was minimal at first. Each person focused on the basic necessities of rehydration and nutrition. The food provided was simple but effective: energy bars, dried fruit, and electrolyte drinks designed to rapidly restore depleted systems. Sarah could feel her strength returning with each mouthful, though her hands continued to shake from the adrenaline crash that followed extreme stress. As the 2-hour rest period progressed, the candidates began to share fragments of their individual experiences. Thompson described getting lost for 3 hours when his compass became unreliable near what he later discovered was an old mining site with significant metal deposits. Jackson had encountered a family of javelinas that had forced him to take a lengthy detour around their territory. Each story reinforced the randomness of the challenges they had faced and the narrow margin between success and failure. Martinez revealed that he had come close to quitting twice during the night, once when he fell into a hidden wash and injured his shoulder, and again when he became convinced that he was walking in circles. Only the thought of his daughters had kept him moving forward when logic suggested that continuing was pointless. The admission surprised Sarah, who had viewed Martinez as unshakable throughout the selection process. "I kept thinking about what I would tell my girls if I came home empty-handed," Martinez said quietly. "How do you explain to a 6-year-old that Daddy gave up when things got hard?" The conversation was interrupted when Sergeant Major Williams entered the shelter carrying his clipboard and wearing an expression that somehow managed to be both serious and satisfied. The candidates automatically straightened into more military postures despite their exhaustion, the ingrained habits of years of service overriding their physical discomfort. Williams studied each of them for a long moment before speaking, his gaze seeming to peer into their souls and catalog what he found there. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested they were about to learn something that would change their understanding of everything they had experienced. "You four have accomplished something that most people would consider impossible. You survived a test that was designed to reveal the absolute limits of human endurance and determination. But what you don't yet understand is that the physical challenge was only the beginning. The real test starts now." Williams gestured for them to follow him outside the shelter, where they found a surprising scene waiting for them. A small convoy of vehicles had arrived while they were resting, and several people in civilian clothes were setting up what appeared to be a sophisticated communications center. Satellite dishes, computer terminals, and radio equipment created a high-tech oasis in the middle of the desert wilderness. "Delta Force operations don't happen in isolation," Williams continued as they watched the setup process. "Everything we do requires coordination with intelligence agencies, foreign allies, and political leadership at the highest levels. Physical toughness is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need operators who can think strategically under pressure and make decisions that affect national security." One of the civilians, a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, approached their group. Williams introduced her as Dr. Rebecca Stone, a psychologist who specialized in stress evaluation and personnel selection for highly classified government programs. Dr. Stone smiled warmly, but her eyes remained analytical as she studied each candidate. "Congratulations on making it this far. What you've accomplished represents the top 1% of human performance under extreme stress. But we need to determine if you have the psychological profile necessary for Delta Force operations." She led them to an area where 4 stations had been set up, each equipped with a computer terminal, headphones, and various testing materials. The setup looked more appropriate for a university research facility than a military selection course, and Sarah began to realize that the evaluation process was far more sophisticated than she had imagined. "You'll be participating in a series of psychological assessments that will measure your decision-making capabilities under simulated operational stress," Dr. Stone explained. "These scenarios are based on real missions that Delta Force operators have conducted, though obviously the details have been sanitized for security purposes. Sarah sat down at her assigned station and put on the headphones as instructed. The computer screen flickered to life, displaying what appeared to be a satellite image of a Middle Eastern city. A voice in her headphones began describing a hostage situation involving American diplomats, and she realized she was being placed in the role of a mission commander responsible for planning and executing a rescue operation. The scenario was incredibly detailed and complex. She had to consider factors ranging from weather conditions and enemy force strength to political ramifications and civilian casualties. Every decision she made triggered new complications that required immediate responses. The simulation included realistic time pressure, with constantly updated intelligence reports and demands for immediate action from simulated superiors. As Sarah worked through the scenario, she became aware that she was being monitored not just by the computer system, but by human observers who were taking notes on her decision-making process. Cameras recorded her facial expressions and body language, while sensors apparently measured physiological responses like heart rate and stress hormones. The first scenario lasted 2 hours and culminated in a successful rescue mission, though Sarah's decisions had resulted in significant collateral damage and international diplomatic complications. Before she could fully process the results, a new scenario began, this time involving a counter-terrorism operation in a major American city. The psychological pressure was intense in ways that the physical challenges had never been. During the desert survival test, failure would have affected only her own life. In these simulations, her decisions affected the lives of hostages, civilian bystanders, fellow operators, and potentially the broader national security interests of the United States. The weight of responsibility was almost crushing. Between scenarios, Dr. Stone conducted individual interviews with each candidate, exploring their thought processes and emotional responses to the simulated missions. Her questions were probing and sometimes uncomfortable, designed to reveal aspects of personality and character that might not be apparent under normal circumstances. How do you feel about the civilian casualties that resulted from your decisions in the first scenario? She asked Sarah during one such interview. Sarah considered her response carefully. The honest answer was that she felt terrible about the deaths of innocent people, even in a simulation. But she also understood that such casualties were sometimes unavoidable in real-world operations, and that emotional paralysis could lead to even worse outcomes. I feel responsible for those deaths, but I also understand that inaction would have resulted in the certain death of all the hostages plus unknown numbers of additional civilians. Command decisions in combat situations require accepting responsibility for imperfect outcomes. Dr. Stone made notes and asked follow-up questions that explored Sarah's ability to compartmentalize emotional responses while maintaining her humanity and moral compass. It was a delicate balance that Sarah had never been forced to articulate before. The psychological testing continued for 6 hours, covering scenarios that ranged from traditional military operations to complex intelligence-gathering missions. Some involved split-second decisions under fire, while others required patient planning and coordination with multiple agencies. All of them demanded a level of cognitive flexibility and stress tolerance that went far beyond anything Sarah had encountered in conventional military training. During breaks between scenarios, the candidates compared their experiences and began to understand that they were being evaluated not just as individual operators, but as potential team members. Some of the scenarios required coordination between multiple operators, and their ability to communicate effectively under pressure was clearly being assessed. Martinez struggled with scenarios that required rapid decision-making, his methodical approach serving him poorly when time constraints demanded immediate action. Thompson excelled at tactical planning, but had difficulty adapting when initial assumptions proved incorrect. Jackson showed excellent situational awareness, but tended to become overly focused on details at the expense of broader strategic considerations. Sarah discovered that her greatest strength lay in synthesizing information from multiple sources and identifying patterns that weren't immediately obvious. Her analytical mind, honed by years of intelligence work, allowed her to see connections that others might miss. But she also found herself second-guessing decisions more than was operationally useful. As the day progressed, it became clear that the psychological evaluation was as much about eliminating candidates as identifying successful ones. Thompson was pulled aside for additional individual testing after struggling with a scenario involving potential friendly fire casualties. His difficulty accepting the necessity of risking American lives to save a larger number of hostages suggested a philosophical incompatibility with Delta Force operations. The final scenario of the day was perhaps the most challenging because it had no clear correct answer. Sarah found herself in command of an operation to eliminate a high-value target who was using his own children as human shields. Every option available to her involved serious moral compromises, and the simulation was designed to test how she would function when forced to choose between competing values. She ultimately chose to abort the mission rather than risk killing innocent children, a decision that resulted in the simulated terrorist escaping to conduct additional attacks. The computer calculated that her choice would lead to hundreds of civilian deaths over the following months, deaths that could have been prevented by accepting the immediate moral cost of harming the terrorist's children. Dr. Stone's debriefing session that evening was intense and emotionally draining. She forced each candidate to confront the full implications of their decisions and to articulate their reasoning under hostile questioning. The process was designed to identify individuals who might break under the psychological pressure of real-world operations where perfect moral clarity was a luxury that couldn't be afforded. Delta Force operators sometimes have to make decisions that would be considered war crimes if they were made by conventional military personnel, Dr. Stone explained. We operate in legal and ethical gray areas where normal rules don't apply. We need people who can function in that environment without losing their humanity or their sanity. The revelation was sobering and forced Sarah to confront aspects of military service that she had never seriously considered. She had joined the military to serve her country and protect innocent people, but Delta Force apparently required a willingness to accept moral ambiguity that challenged her fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. Dawn broke over the desert camp with an urgency that seemed to match the tension Sarah felt building in her chest. The final day of Delta Force selection had arrived, and with it came the knowledge that everything she thought she understood about military service was about to be challenged in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Sarah and Martinez were the only candidates remaining from the original group of 47 who had started the selection course 6 weeks earlier. The attrition rate was staggering, but Williams had explained that Delta Force couldn't afford to lower its standards even slightly. The margin for error in their operations was so narrow that a single weak link could compromise missions and cost lives on a global scale. The camp had been transformed overnight into something that resembled a high-tech operations center. Satellite communication dishes pointed skyward like electronic flowers seeking signals from space. Banks of computer monitors displayed real-time intelligence feeds from around the world. The civilian personnel who had arrived the previous day moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to handling classified information at the highest levels of government. Dr. Stone approached Sarah and Martinez as they finished their morning meal, carrying tablets that contained what she described as their final briefing materials. Her demeanor had shifted from the clinical detachment of the previous day to something approaching grave seriousness. What you're about to experience represents a fundamental shift in your understanding of how America protects its interests in the modern world, she began. Delta Force operations often occur in the spaces between conventional law and morality, where normal military and legal frameworks don't provide adequate guidance. She handed them the tablets, which displayed detailed case studies of actual Delta Force missions from the past decade. The operations described went far beyond anything Sarah had encountered in her conventional military experience. These weren't the clear-cut combat missions depicted in movies or recruitment materials, but complex intelligence operations that blurred the lines between military action and espionage. The first case study involved the assassination of a terrorist financier in a European capital, carried out in such a way that it appeared to be the result of internecine conflict within the terrorist organization itself. Delta Force operators had spent months establishing false identities and infiltrating the target's inner circle before executing a plan that eliminated him while protecting American involvement from discovery. The second case detailed an operation to recover stolen nuclear materials that had involved Delta operators posing as arms dealers and conducting business with international criminal organizations. The mission had required them to participate in illegal activities, including drug trafficking and money laundering, in order to maintain their cover identities. Sarah felt her understanding of military service shifting as she read through mission after mission that challenged every ethical principle she had been taught during her military career. These operations existed in a realm where the ends justified means that would be considered criminal in any other context. The question you need to answer today, Dr. Stone continued, is whether you can accept responsibility for actions that serve American interests but violate conventional moral and legal standards. Delta Force operators must be capable of functioning as assassins, infiltrators, and sometimes criminals in service of objectives that you may never fully understand. Martinez looked troubled as he reviewed the case studies on his tablet. His background as a Green Beret had involved complex operations in foreign countries, but nothing approaching the moral ambiguity described in these mission reports. Sarah could see him struggling with the implications of what they were being asked to consider. Williams approached their group carrying a secure communication device that connected him directly to what he described as higher authority. His conversation was brief and conducted in carefully coded language, but when he finished, his expression suggested that they were about to receive information of extraordinary sensitivity. "You've been cleared for a real-time operational briefing," Williams announced. "What you're about to see is classified at levels that most military personnel will never access. The briefing will be conducted by personnel whose identities you must never reveal, regarding an operation that officially doesn't exist." The communications center had been configured to receive a secure video transmission from an undisclosed location. When the connection was established, Sarah found herself looking at a conference room where several individuals in civilian clothes sat around a polished table. Their faces were partially obscured by the video quality, but their bearings suggested senior intelligence officials. The briefing that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. The officials described a current crisis involving American hostages being held by a criminal organization that had connections to both terrorist groups and hostile foreign governments. Conventional diplomatic and military options had been exhausted, and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The hostages were being held in a location that was technically outside any legal jurisdiction where American military forces could operate openly. Rescue would require Delta Force operators to conduct an illegal border crossing, eliminate dozens of armed criminals, and extract the hostages while maintaining plausible deniability for American involvement. But the complexity went deeper than simple operational challenges. Intelligence suggested that some of the hostages had been compromised and were now actively cooperating with their captors. The rescue team would need to determine in real time which individuals could be trusted and which represented security threats that might need to be neutralized along with the enemy personnel. "This is the reality of modern unconventional warfare," one of the officials explained through the video link. "Clean distinctions between friend and enemy, legal and illegal, moral and immoral don't exist in the operational environment where Delta Force operates. We need operators who can make life and death decisions based on incomplete information and accept full responsibility for the consequences." Sarah realized that this wasn't just a briefing about a hypothetical mission, but a description of an operation that was actually being planned and might be executed within days or weeks. The officials were gauging her reaction to determine if she could psychologically handle participation in activities that existed outside normal moral and legal frameworks. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering intelligence assessments, operational planning considerations, and political ramifications that extended far beyond the immediate rescue mission. Sarah learned about America's covert relationships with criminal organizations, the use of assassination as a diplomatic tool, and the existence of operational authorities that bypassed normal governmental oversight mechanisms. Martinez asked pointed questions about rules of engagement and legal protections for operators conducting such missions. The answers he received were unsatisfying and emphasized personal responsibility rather than institutional protection. Delta Force operators were expected to accept full legal and moral responsibility for their actions, even when those actions were ordered by the highest levels of government. Operators who can't accept that level of personal risk shouldn't proceed further in the selection process, Williams stated bluntly. We can't afford to have people in the unit who might hesitate at critical moments because they're worried about legal consequences. The psychological pressure was immense, and unlike anything Sarah had encountered during her military service, she was being asked to commit to a level of moral flexibility that challenged her fundamental beliefs about right and wrong, law and justice. The physical challenges of selection had been difficult, but this test reached into the core of her identity and forced her to question everything she thought she knew about serving her country. Dr. Stone conducted individual counseling sessions with both candidates to explore their emotional and psychological responses to the briefing. Her questions were probing and designed to identify any reservations that might compromise operational effectiveness in real-world missions. How do you feel about the possibility that you might be ordered to kill someone who isn't technically an enemy combatant? She asked Sarah during their session. Sarah struggled to formulate a response that accurately reflected her internal conflict. The logical part of her mind understood that modern threats to national security couldn't always be addressed through conventional military means. But the moral framework that had guided her throughout her life resisted accepting the necessity of extrajudicial killing. I understand that protecting American lives might require actions that wouldn't be acceptable in other contexts, she finally replied. I'm prepared to accept responsibility for decisions made in service of legitimate national security objectives. Dr. Stone pressed further, exploring Sarah's ability to compartmentalize moral concerns and function effectively despite ethical ambiguity. The questioning revealed that successful Delta Force operators needed a psychological profile that balanced moral sensitivity with operational flexibility, maintaining their humanity while accepting responsibilities that might destroy less resilient individuals. The afternoon session involved practical exercises that simulated the decision-making processes described in the morning briefing. Sarah and Martinez were placed in scenarios where they had to choose between protecting innocent lives and achieving strategic objectives, where conventional moral calculus provided no clear guidance. In one exercise, Sarah was placed in command of a mission to eliminate a terrorist leader who was using a children's hospital as his headquarters. Intelligence indicated that he was planning an attack that would kill hundreds of civilians within days, but any assault on his position would inevitably result in the deaths of sick children who were patients in the hospital. The exercise forced her to weigh competing moral imperatives in real time while dealing with incomplete information and time pressure that simulated actual operational conditions. Every option available to her involved accepting responsibility for deaths that would result from her decisions. Sarah chose to authorize a precision strike that minimized but didn't eliminate casualties at the hospital, accepting the deaths of some innocent children to prevent the larger terrorist attack. The decision was operationally sound but emotionally devastating, and she found herself shaking as she walked through the implications with Dr. Stone afterward. How will you live with the knowledge that your decisions resulted in the deaths of innocent children? Dr. Stone asked. The question cut to the heart of what Delta Force service apparently demanded: the ability to accept moral responsibility for decisions that served larger strategic objectives while maintaining enough humanity to be trusted with such awesome responsibilities. It was a psychological balancing act that few people could sustain over extended periods. Martinez struggled more visibly with the exercises, his strong moral convictions coming into conflict with the operational necessities described in the scenarios. During one simulation, he refused to authorize an operation that would have saved American hostages but required the death of the terrorists' family members who were being used as human shields. His decision was morally admirable but operationally unacceptable according to Delta Force standards. The refusal to accept necessary moral compromises suggested a psychological profile that was incompatible with the unit's mission requirements. Williams delivered the results of the evaluation as the sun began to set over the desert landscape that had served as the backdrop for their transformation over the past weeks. Martinez was being released from the selection process, his moral integrity deemed too rigid for the operational flexibility that Delta Force required. 6 months after her selection, Sarah stood in a nondescript building outside Fort Bragg, North Carolina, wearing civilian clothes and carrying identification that listed her occupation as a defense contractor. The transformation from conventional soldier to Delta Force operator had been more profound than anything the selection course had prepared her for, involving not just advanced tactical training, but a fundamental rewiring of her psychological and moral frameworks. The training that followed her selection had been conducted in facilities that didn't appear on any official military maps, taught by instructors whose real names she would never know. She had learned skills that went far beyond conventional military capabilities, advanced surveillance techniques, psychological manipulation, and what the training manuals euphemistically called direct action in denied areas. More challenging than the technical training had been the psychological conditioning designed to prepare operators for the moral ambiguity of real-world missions. Sarah had participated in increasingly complex scenarios that forced her to make decisions involving life and death, legal and illegal, right and wrong, until the distinctions began to blur in ways that would have horrified her former self. The woman who emerged from this training was recognizably Sarah Mitchell, but fundamentally changed in ways that she was still learning to understand. She could kill with her hands or with sophisticated weapons, conduct surveillance in urban environments without being detected, and manipulate people psychologically to obtain information or cooperation. But the cost of these capabilities was a growing distance from the moral certainties that had once defined her identity. Her first real mission came with no advance warning and minimal briefing. Williams appeared at her apartment at 3 a.m. with a sealed envelope and instructions to be ready to deploy within 6 hours. The target was a human trafficking operation based in Eastern Europe, led by a former military officer who had been selling information to hostile intelligence services while using his criminal network to fund terrorist operations. The official story, if anyone asked, was that Sarah was part of a Defense Department assessment team evaluating security cooperation programs in the region. Her actual mission was to infiltrate the trafficking organization, gather intelligence on its operations, and eliminate key personnel in ways that appeared to result from internecine criminal violence rather than American military action. Sarah spent 3 weeks in a city whose name she was instructed never to record or remember, living under a false identity, and gradually working her way into the confidence of criminals whose activities represented everything she had sworn to oppose as a soldier. She witnessed atrocities that violated every principle of human decency, but her orders required her to maintain her cover rather than intervene to help the victims. The psychological strain was enormous. By day, she participated in planning sessions where human beings were discussed as commodities to be bought and sold. By night, she transmitted intelligence to handlers whose faces she had never seen and whose real authorities she could only guess at. The disconnect between her actions and her values created a constant internal tension that threatened to overwhelm her psychological defenses. The mission culminated in a carefully orchestrated sequence of events that eliminated 7 key members of the trafficking organization while making their deaths appear to result from a dispute with a rival criminal group. Sarah personally killed 3 of them, using techniques that ensured their deaths appeared to be the work of competing criminals rather than highly trained military operators. When she returned to the United States, Sarah found that she could no longer relate to the world she had left behind. Conversations with civilian friends felt hollow and artificial, focused on concerns that seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions that had become her daily reality. Even interactions with conventional military personnel felt strained, separated by experiences that she could never describe or explain. Dr. Stone conducted regular psychological evaluations designed to monitor operators for signs of stress, moral injury, or psychological breakdown. These sessions were mandatory and intensive, exploring every aspect of operators' mental and emotional states with scientific precision. How do you process the disconnect between your actions and your original moral framework? Dr. Stone asked during one such session. Sarah struggled to articulate feelings that seemed to exist beyond the reach of normal language. I've learned to compartmentalize different aspects of my identity. The person who conducts operations exists separately from the person who evaluates those operations morally. If I tried to integrate them completely, I don't think I could function. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Delta Force operators to function effectively were sophisticated but fragile. Sarah learned that the unit had a high rate of psychological casualties, operators who eventually couldn't sustain the internal contradictions required by their missions. Some suffered complete psychological breakdowns, while others gradually lost their ability to distinguish between operational necessities and personal desires for violence or control. Her second mission took place in a major American city, targeting a terrorist cell that had been planning an attack on a civilian target. The complexity of operating on American soil added legal and political complications that made overseas missions seem simple by comparison. Every action had to be carefully planned to avoid detection by local law enforcement while maintaining complete deniability for government involvement. Sarah spent 2 months living under a false identity in an apartment complex where several members of the terrorist cell resided. She developed personal relationships with people she knew she might eventually have to kill, learning about their families, their motivations, and their human weaknesses while planning their destruction. The moral weight of these relationships was crushing in ways that overseas operations had never been. These weren't anonymous foreign criminals, but people she had shared meals with, whose children she had met, whose personal struggles she had listened to with apparent sympathy. The betrayal of trust required by her mission felt like a violation of something fundamental about human relationships. When the operation finally commenced, Sarah found herself in the position of having to choose which members of the cell to eliminate and which to allow to live. Intelligence suggested that some were committed terrorists while others were simply individuals who had been manipulated into providing support without understanding the full scope of the planned attack. The decisions she made that night haunted her in ways that previous missions had not. She killed people who trusted her, spared others who might pose future threats, and accepted responsibility for judgments that would affect the lives of innocent family members who had no involvement in terrorist activities. The psychological aftermath of domestic operations was particularly severe because operators had to return to normal life in the same society where they had just conducted lethal operations. Sarah would see news reports about the incident that bore no resemblance to what had actually occurred, read commentary from experts who had no understanding of the real circumstances, and listened to debates about terrorism and security that seemed to exist in a completely different reality from her operational experience. Williams explained that this psychological isolation was an inevitable consequence of Delta Force service. Operators exist in a reality that's separate from the rest of society, he told her during one of their regular check-ins. The things we know and do create a barrier that can't be bridged through normal human relationships. It's the price we pay for maintaining capabilities that most people couldn't psychologically handle. As Sarah's operational experience expanded, she began to understand that Delta Force served functions that went far beyond what was described in official military doctrine. The unit was a tool for implementing foreign policy through means that couldn't be acknowledged publicly, conducting operations that existed in the gaps between diplomacy and conventional warfare. She participated in missions that influenced foreign elections, eliminated individuals whose deaths served American strategic interests, and conducted intelligence operations that violated the sovereignty of allied nations. Each operation was justified by classified intelligence assessments and strategic objectives that she was told served vital American interests, but the cumulative effect was a growing sense of moral vertigo. The psychological support systems provided to operators were sophisticated but ultimately inadequate for the stresses they faced. Regular counseling sessions, peer support groups, and recreational activities were designed to maintain psychological health, but they couldn't address the fundamental contradiction between operators' actions and the moral frameworks of the society they served. Sarah found herself developing relationships primarily with other operators who shared similar experiences and psychological burdens. These relationships were intense but fragile, based on shared understanding of experiences that couldn't be discussed outside the unit. Even within Delta Force, operators often couldn't share details of their individual missions, creating layers of isolation even within their professional community. The financial compensation for Delta Force service was substantial, but came with restrictions that reinforced operators' separation from normal society. Large portions of their pay were deposited into accounts that could only be accessed after retirement, and their spending was monitored to prevent activities that might compromise operational security. More significantly, operators' families were subject to extensive background investigations and ongoing surveillance that affected every aspect of their lives. Sarah had chosen not to maintain romantic relationships because of the security implications, but she watched other operators struggle with the impact of their service on spouses and children who could never fully understand the source of their psychological distance. After 2 years of operational service, Sarah was approached about transitioning to training responsibilities that would involve passing on her experience to new candidates. The offer represented recognition of her operational success, but also acknowledgement that her psychological profile was showing signs of stress that made continued field operations inadvisable. The conversation with Williams about her future was conducted in the same desert location where she had completed selection, bringing her full circle to the place where her transformation had begun. The landscape looked the same, but Sarah understood that she was a fundamentally different person than the woman who had walked through these hills carrying water and hope in equal measure. "You've served with distinction in situations that would have broken most people," Williams told her. "But the psychological evaluations suggest that you're approaching the limits of what anyone can sustain in this role. We'd like you to consider helping us train the next generation of operators." Sarah looked out at the desert that had first taught her about survival and adaptation. She understood now that the physical challenges of selection had been the easy part, designed to identify individuals with the basic capabilities necessary for more profound psychological transformation. The real test had been whether she could maintain her humanity while accepting responsibilities that existed outside normal moral frameworks. The woman who had entered selection believing in clear distinctions between right and wrong had evolved into someone who understood that protecting American interests sometimes required actions that couldn't be justified by conventional moral standards. The transformation had been necessary and successful, but it had come at a personal cost that was only now becoming fully apparent. As Sarah considered her future, she realized that her service with Delta Force had given her capabilities and insights that could never be unlearned or forgotten. She had seen how American power actually operated in the world, understood the true costs of maintaining national security, and accepted personal responsibility for decisions that most people could never imagine facing. The desert wind carried the sounds of other candidates undergoing selection somewhere in the distance, their voices mixing with the eternal silence of the landscape that had shaped so many lives over the decades. Sarah listened to those sounds and wondered what truths they would discover about themselves and about their country in the trials that lay ahead. Her journey from abandoned candidate to Delta Force operator was complete, but she understood now that completion was just another form of beginning. The person she had become through service to her country would carry the weight of that transformation for the rest of her life, regardless of what roles she chose to play going forward. The desert had taught her that survival sometimes required abandoning everything you thought you knew about yourself. Delta Force had taught her that serving your country sometimes required abandoning everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. The sun set over the desert as Sarah made her decision about the future, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of the beauty that could exist even in the harshest environments. She would accept the training assignment and help create the next generation of operators who would carry similar burdens in service of objectives they might never fully understand. It was, she realized, the most meaningful way she could use the hard-won wisdom that the desert and Delta Force had given her. Sarah had been selected for final approval, pending completion of additional psychological evaluation and security clearance investigations. But Williams's expression suggested that her success came with costs that she was only beginning to understand. "Congratulations, Mitchell. You've demonstrated the psychological and physical capabilities necessary for Delta Force operations. But I want you to understand what you're accepting. Once you're fully operational, there's no going back to conventional military service. The things you'll see and do will change you in ways that can't be undone." Sarah looked out at the desert that had tested her limits and revealed capabilities she didn't know she possessed. The landscape was beautiful in its harshness, demanding adaptation and compromise for survival. She realized that Delta Force service would require similar adaptations to thrive in an environment where normal moral landmarks couldn't provide reliable guidance. As she prepared to leave the selection site and begin the final phases of her training, Sarah wondered if she truly understood what she was accepting. The physical challenges had been brutal but temporary. The moral challenges that lay ahead would require permanent changes to her fundamental understanding of right and wrong, changes that would affect every aspect of her life going forward. The desert had taught her that survival sometimes required abandoning conventional wisdom and trusting instincts that went beyond rational analysis. Delta Force service would apparently require similar faith in authorities and objectives that she might never fully comprehend. Whether she could maintain her humanity while accepting such responsibilities remained to be seen. Williams returned as the psychological testing concluded, carrying news that would determine which candidates would continue to the final phase of selection. Thompson had been eliminated, his psychological profile indicating insufficient flexibility for the moral compromises that Delta Force operations sometimes required. Jackson was being held for additional evaluation, his performance falling into a gray area that required further testing. Sarah and Martinez were informed that they had passed the psychological evaluation and would proceed to the final phase of selection. But Williams's expression suggested that this achievement was not necessarily cause for celebration. "Tomorrow you'll learn what Delta Force actually does," he told them. "Everything up to this point has been about determining if you have the capability to become operators. Tomorrow is about determining if you have the will to accept what that actually means." As Sarah lay on her cot that night, staring up at the desert stars that had guided her through the darkness, she wondered if she really wanted to know what the final test would reveal. The physical challenges had been brutal but straightforward. The psychological testing had been complex but ultimately comprehensible. Something in Williams's tone suggested that the final phase would challenge her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The desert night sounds that had seemed menacing during her solo journey now felt almost comforting. Coyotes called in the distance, and she could hear the rustle of small creatures moving through the sparse vegetation. But beneath these natural sounds, she detected something else, the low hum of generators and electronic equipment that suggested the final phase of her testing would involve technology and capabilities that went far beyond anything she had encountered in conventional military service. Tomorrow would reveal whether her dream of joining Delta Force was worth the price that membership apparently demanded. How did she feel? She felt like she had died and been resurrected, like she had discovered reserves of strength she never knew existed, like she had been tested by forces beyond human understanding and had somehow survived. But military protocol demanded a more concise response. "I'm ready for the next evolution, Sergeant Major." Williams nodded and made a notation on his omnipresent clipboard. But this time, there was something different about his demeanor, a subtle shift that suggested the game had changed in ways Sarah didn't yet understand. "The next evolution isn't what you think it is, Mitchell. Everything you've been through up to this point has been preparation for the real test. Are you ready to learn what Delta Force actually demands of its operators?" Sarah looked around the camp and realized that she was not the only candidate who had made it this far. Martinez was there, along with two other soldiers she recognized from earlier phases of the selection. They all showed signs of extreme exhaustion and dehydration, but they had survived their individual ordeals and reached this final gathering point. Williams gestured toward the shelter where the other candidates waited. "Go get some water and food. Rest for exactly 2 hours. Then, we'll begin the final phase of your evaluation." As Sarah walked toward the shelter on unsteady legs, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had experienced so far had been elaborate preparation for something much more serious. The desert had tested her physical and mental limits, but it hadn't yet revealed the true nature of what Delta Force expected from its members. That revelation was still to come. Sarah read the instructions 3 times, hoping she had somehow misunderstood their meaning. But the words were clear and unambiguous. She was being ordered to abandon the very resources that had kept her alive for the past 3 weeks and venture into some of the most hostile terrain in North America with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her hands shook slightly as she held the paper. This went against every survival principle she had ever learned. Water was life in the desert, and abandoning it was essentially a death sentence. The radio was her only connection to help if something went wrong. The food, though limited, provided the calories necessary to maintain physical function. But the instructions were clear, and defying them would mean automatic dismissal from the course. Sarah looked around at the vast emptiness surrounding her and realized she was facing the most important decision of her military career. Everything she had worked for, every sacrifice she had made, came down to this moment of choice. She could follow the instructions and risk her life on the chance that this was simply an extreme test of obedience and courage. Or she could keep her survival gear and accept that her dream of joining Delta Force was over. Either choice carried consequences she wasn't sure she could live with. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples. In a few hours, temperatures would drop dramatically, but that relief would be temporary. By morning, the sun would return with renewed intensity, and without water, her chances of survival would diminish rapidly. Sarah made her choice. She carefully placed her water bottles, food supplies, and radio in a small pile beside a distinctive rock formation that she marked on her map. Then, she shouldered her now significantly lighter rucksack and began walking toward coordinates that lay somewhere in the darkness ahead. What she didn't know was that hidden cameras were recording her every move, and that her decision to follow orders despite the apparent danger had just moved her one step closer to understanding what Delta Force really demanded of its operators. The desert that stretched ahead of her was about to become both her greatest enemy and her most important teacher. The real test was just beginning.